were blessed by the discussion of Jesus' priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek, if they had been persuaded by this third warning from becoming dull of hearing in chapter 5 and verse 11. As we turn to chapter 7, we'll see further teachings about Messiah's priestly office throughout this entire chapter 7, the 28 verses here. As we look at it, at this chapter, our inspired writer here began the discussion of the priesthood of Christ back in chapter 3 and verse 1. And he expanded on that thought in chapter 4 and verse 14 all the way through to chapter 5 and verse 10. And after a brief delay, which he dealt with the problem of immaturity, he now returns to this theme that he picks up where he left off can be easily seen by comparing chapter 5 and verse 10 with chapter 6 and verse 20. Both passages making a clear statement that Christ has become our high priest after the order of Melchizedek. If we give careful thought to the priesthood in general, it reminds us that one, man sins when breaking God's law. Two, because of sin, if man is to be saved, it's necessary that some means of reconciliation be provided. And number three, the system of the Old Testament was inadequate and limited. Number four, because of that inadequacy in the old law, there was a need for something better that could provide an adequate means of approach to God. And the writer will now show that Christ is superior to the priesthood of Aaron and the Levitical system of sacrifices. He'll compare the priesthood of Christ with that of Melchizedek, pointing out that Christ is our high priest after the order of Melchizedek. There are some points, however, that we should consider as we look more closely at this chapter before we get into verse 1. First, there's any indication that Christ was our high priest after the order of Melchizedek was equal to saying that the order of Aaron was set aside, and with it all the ordinances of the law of Moses. Now, this may have been one of the most difficult things for these Hebrews to accept, because it meant rejecting everything that they had been taught, they had believed and practiced. It meant forsaking everything that their fathers had honored for almost 2 centuries. And number two, this was an entire new doctrine for these Hebrews. Our Lord made no specific reference to his priesthood during his time here on earth. Only after our Lord's ascension did this concept of Jesus as our high priest come to full light. Such a doctrine would be faced with an immediate objection that Christ could not serve as high priest because he was not of the tribe of Levi. He was not in the line of priests. And it's important for us to keep in mind that the difficulty this must have presented to the original audience of this letter, that in order to better appreciate this chapter, we must attempt to place ourselves in the shoes of that original audience. And with these things in mind, as we approach verse 1, let's look at this man Melchizedek for just a moment. Well, there are only 2 Old Testament scriptures that provide us with any information about this man. One being the historical account of his association with Abraham. That's back in Genesis chapter 14, verse 18 through 20. And the other, a quote regarding the priesthood of the Messiah. Of course, that was Psalm chapter 110 that we've mentioned several times. In the historical account in Genesis, he kind of arrives out of the blue and just as quickly disappears from the scene. But before he passes into history, we do learn a few things about this man, Melchizedek. We learned that number one, he was the king of Salem. And Salem is generally accepted to be the ancient city of Jerusalem. Number two, we learned he brought forth bread and wine. Number three, he was the priest of the Most High God. Number four, he blessed Abraham. And number five, he received tithes from Abraham. Nothing is said of the genealogy of his priesthood. We're not even told who his parents were, and this is something unheard of with regards to priests of God. He had no father who served as priest. So let's look at verse 1 as we begin chapter 7. Verse 1 begins, and verse 1 is actually the beginning of a sentence that continues through verse 3. So let's just begin by reading those first three verses. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being by interpretation king of righteousness, and after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace, without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. That's all one sentence. As we look at verse 1, it begins, for this Melchizedek, that the priesthood of Melchizedek is superior to the priesthood of Aaron is shown by three different emphasis. First, Melchizedek was a type of Christ. We'll see in verse 1 through 3. Melchizedek was greater than Abraham in verse 4 through 10. And the Melchizedek priesthood of Jesus brings in a perfection that the priesthood of Aaron was unable to provide. This will be in verses 11 through 19. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, as we mentioned, Salem is a name given to the ancients. It's the ancient name of Jerusalem. And then king of Salem, priest of the Most High God. That Melchizedek served in both the office of king and priest was not at all that remarkable. There are ancient records that indicate that was not unusual for the same person to hold both offices at the same time. But what was unique about Melchizedek is that he was king and priest of the Most High God. But how is it that Melchizedek was a high priest of God, seeing that no provisions was made in the earlier chapters of Genesis for a priestly class of individuals? The only possible explanation is that God established and authorized the office of Melchizedek separate and apart from the record we have in the early chapters of Genesis. Even more remarkable is that God provided for the priesthood of Melchizedek in advance as a predictive type of our Lord's priesthood. Priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings. We suppose the reason Melchizedek came to meet Abraham was to express gratitude for Abraham having freed the country from those inflicting hardships and difficulties on the country, and in order also to furnish refreshments to the party which Abraham headed. And then verse 1 concludes with the three words, "and blessed him." Let's look at the actual words of the blessings that was recorded in Genesis chapter 14. Genesis chapter 14, beginning with verse 19. Verse 19, "And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. And he gave them tithes of all." Well, these are the actual words of the blessing that's recorded here in this chapter, in the chapter of Genesis. Verse 2, "To whom also Abraham divided a tenth of all." The Greek word for tenth of all is the Greek word dekada, which means a tenth part of anything, a tithe. We're not provided with any details as to exactly why Abraham selected to give a tenth of the spoils taken from battle. But it would be reasonable to suppose that he made them in harmony with what he knew to be an existing God-given ordinance. Then he says in verse 2, "First being by interpretation king of righteousness." Well, first of all tells us that there is even significance in the fact that righteousness comes before peace. It's appropriate that one bearing such a name as Melchizedek should represent our Lord, because our Lord is indeed the King of righteousness. And after that also King of Salem, which is King of peace. The place named Salem comes from the same root word shalom, the Hebrew word for peace. The word peace means more than the absence of war. It also involves the presence of a positive blessing, a spiritual blessing from God. And the mention of Melchizedek being both king of righteousness and king of Salem is to provide yet another name equally significant. Our Lord is the only absolutely righteous person ever to walk on the face of the earth. And it's through his righteousness and the perfect blood that was shed that we obtain peace with our God. Verse number 3, "Without father, without mother, without descent." The word descent there meaning genealogy. It must be remembered that the Levitical and Melchizedek priesthoods are being contrasted and compared here. Now, in the Levitical system, the priest family tree was very, very important. The pedigree of both father and mother, clear back to Aaron, was carefully recorded in Leviticus chapter 21 and Ezra chapter 2, as well as Nehemiah chapter 7. But how different it is with Melchizedek. There's no record made of either the name of his father or mother, nor any of his family members. And it's not like Melchizedek didn't have a father and mother. All it says is that their names are not found in the scriptures. Of course, he did have parents and descendants, as Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 6 seems to imply. He did have a family tree. Compared to the genealogy table of Christ that's clearly given in Matthew 1 and in Luke 3, Melchizedek's likeness to Jesus is in the priestly function, not in the human family tree. Having neither beginning of days nor end of life. This doesn't mean that Melchizedek was never born or that he never died. It merely means that there's nothing in the scriptures about his birth or death. This refers to the fact that Melchizedek's priesthood, as well as that of Christ, was unbroken and uninterrupted by any changes of succession. The priest and high priest in that age entered into service at age 30, and nothing is said about the age of retirement. There are no such restrictions or instructions regarding the priesthood of Melchizedek. Nothing is said when he entered the office, nor is there a mention of his retirement or a cessation in his service. Hence the phrase, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, must be referring to the office of Melchizedek. But made like unto the Son of God. The writer of Hebrews here tells us that when the Old Testament record was written, God deliberately led the writers to include and to omit certain facts that Melchizedek would serve as a type of Jesus. The points in which Melchizedek and Christ correspond as types and antitypes are these. He is the King of righteousness and King of peace. He acts in accordance with a priest constantly. He had no ancestors in his priestly office. He has no successors in his priestly office. He is a priest of a different order than Aaron's order. He united himself the office of king and priest, served both at the same time. Now, verse 3 closes this sentence with these words, abideth a priest continually. The Greek word for continually used here occurs only in Hebrews. It occurs 4 times in Hebrews. It doesn't so much indicate duration without end as it does duration which lasts through the circumstances indicated in this particular case. Of course, when Melchizedek died, his priesthood ended, and Jesus also will cease his priestly functions when the church shall have been redeemed in 1 Corinthians 15. Verse 4 begins, now consider how great this man was. There are 4 lines of thought here that will develop the theme that Melchizedek was greater than Abraham. In verses 4 through 10, Abraham gave tithes to Melchizedek. Number 2, Melchizedek blessed Abraham. Number 3, no succession of men followed Melchizedek. And number 4, Levi, in a sense, paid tithes to Melchizedek. Now, what's the point in showing that Melchizedek was greater than Abraham? The Jews had a great appreciation for Abraham, and if it could be shown that Melchizedek was superior to Abraham, then it would be easy to demonstrate the superiority of Christ as a priest to all who descended from Abraham. Now consider how great this man was, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of spoils. The word patriarch comes from a Greek word that means father or ruler. Abraham was a great man. To his neighbors, he was Prince of God. Genesis chapter 23 and verse 6 says, "Hear us, my Lord, thou art a mighty prince among us." And God himself called Abraham my friend in Isaiah chapter 41 and verse 8. "But thou, Israel, art my servant Jacob, whom I have chosen, the seed of Abraham, my friend." But in the account of Abraham's meeting with Melchizedek, it's Melchizedek who appears as the greater of the two. That greatness is implied in the fact that Abraham gave tithes to Melchizedek. The Greek word here for the words translated spoils means literally the top of the heap. Of course, the word heap means a stack or a pile. The same word here is used to denote the first fruits of the harvest, taken, as it were, from the very heap of the harvest. It was a Greek and Roman practice to place the harvest in a heap, and as the first thing to take off a portion from the top to dedicate to God as a thank offering. It was the choice spoils which Abraham selected and offered to Melchizedek as the tenth of all, or as an offering to God. We can only conclude that Abraham must have had great respect for Melchizedek. When a man is willing to give the very best to another, well, that's an indication of respect and adoration for that man. Verse 5 begins, "And verily they that are the sons of Levi, who receive the office of the priesthood, have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law." When the sons of Levi were appointed to the priestly office, along with that appointment was the authority to tax people. To tax people for services rendered. The law of Moses, which gave them that authority to collect tithes, thus elevated the priest above the people. And we see this instructions to the Levites to tax Israel in Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 38, and in Deuteronomy 14, verse 22 through 29. But this was not the case with Abraham and Melchizedek. They did not have these instructions. The latter had no such relationship, Melchizedek that is, had no such relationship to Abraham. He had no legal right to demand tithes of Abraham. Abraham's offerings were free will and in recognition of Melchizedek's official position. Christ, as our high priest today, receives free will offerings from his children as we worship each first day of the week. Verse 5 concludes with, "That is, of their brethren, though they came out of the loins of Abraham," the descendants of Abraham. Both the Levitical priests and the Jewish people were descended from Abraham, and as descendants of Abraham, the priesthood of the Levites was inferior to that of Melchizedek. We're going to stop there. It's about 1 minute till the bell time. We'll begin next week with verse 6. Thank you again for your attention this morning.